The billionaire CEO took her roommate to urgent care, then froze at the relationship line. Welcome, everyone. Before we dive into today's heartfelt story about two women whose lives changed forever through an unexpected journey of compassion, vulnerability, and love, I have one small request. If you enjoy emotional stories like this, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a future episode. It only takes a second, it is completely free, and your support allows us to continue creating powerful stories filled with hope, healing, resilience, and unforgettable love between women. We truly appreciate every single one of you. And before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Share your city or your country, we would love to know where our amazing community is growing around the world. Thank you so much for being here. Now, let's step into the moment that changed our main character's life forever. The loneliest people are often the ones everyone else believes have everything. My name is Claire Whitmore, and for years the business magazines insisted on introducing me before I ever had the chance to introduce myself. Billionaire CEO. Visionary. America's youngest woman to build a Fortune 500 technology company from the ground up. They loved the headlines almost as much as investors loved my quarterly reports. Every achievement became another polished photograph, another interview under bright studio lights, another reminder that success looked flawless from the outside. What none of those articles ever mentioned was that every evening I drove through the gates of a 12,000 square foot estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, parked beside a collection of luxury cars I barely touched, unlocked the front door, and stepped into complete silence. There was never anyone asking how my day had gone. No laughter drifting from the kitchen. No television playing in the background. Just the steady hum of climate control and perfectly arranged furniture that looked more like a luxury hotel than a home. I used to tell myself that silence meant peace. Eventually I realized silence could also become a prison. My schedule left little room for anything except work. I was awake before 5 every morning, running exactly 4 miles, answering emails before sunrise, reviewing financial forecasts over black coffee, and moving from one boardroom to another until the city lights replaced daylight outside my office windows. My executive assistant often joked that my calendar had more color than a kindergarten classroom. I smiled politely every time she said it, but the truth was I couldn't remember the last weekend that belonged to me instead of my company. Relationships required time. Friendships required presence. I had mastered neither. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday that began like every other, my property manager called with an unexpected problem. A burst pipe had flooded one of the apartment buildings my family trust owned downtown. Several tenants needed temporary housing while repairs were completed, and one particular resident had nowhere to go. Normally I would have approved a hotel suite without another thought, but every nearby hotel was filled because of an international business conference. There's one more possibility, my property manager said carefully. Miss Emily Carter only needs a place for a few weeks. I almost declined before he finished the sentence. I valued privacy more than almost anything. My house had plenty of empty bedrooms, but that didn't mean I wanted someone living in them. Then he added something I wasn't expecting. She refused special treatment. She kept asking if another family needed help more than she did. That caught my attention. Most people demanded exceptions. This woman was trying to give hers away. Against every instinct that had protected my carefully controlled life for years, I agreed. 45 minutes later I stood in my front hallway watching a woman with chestnut hair and kind hazel eyes step through my front door carrying 2 worn suitcases, an overstuffed backpack, and an embarrassed smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "I promise I'll stay out of your way." I nodded, believing every word she said. What I didn't know was that Emily Carter wasn't about to disrupt my schedule. She was about to transform everything I believed a home was supposed to feel like. The first morning felt strangely formal, almost like two strangers pretending they already knew the rules of a life neither of them had chosen. I left for my morning run at exactly 5 o'clock, expecting the house to remain as quiet as it always had. When I returned 40 minutes later, slightly out of breath and mentally organizing the day's board meeting, the unmistakable aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the foyer. I stopped in my tracks. For a brief second I wondered if I had forgotten to dismiss a catering service. Instead, I found Emily standing in my kitchen wearing a simple gray sweater, reading the instructions on my espresso machine with complete concentration. The moment she noticed me, her eyes widened. "Good morning. I hope you do not mind. I searched online for the manual because this machine looks more complicated than a spaceship." Before I could respond, she slid a mug across the marble island. "I guessed you drink it black." I stared at the cup longer than necessary. Nobody had guessed how I liked my coffee in years. Employees memorized it because my assistant told them. Restaurants stored it in reservation notes. Investors noticed because they wanted something from me. Emily had simply paid attention. "Thank you," I said quietly. She smiled as if those 2 words were enough to brighten her entire morning. That should have been the end of it, but living together has a peculiar way of turning ordinary moments into quiet discoveries. Every evening I returned from the office expecting to find the house exactly as I had left it, yet somehow it always felt warmer. There was soft music playing while dinner simmered on the stove. Fresh flowers appeared in a small vase near the dining room window. A stack of books rested beside the fireplace instead of untouched business magazines. Emily never rearranged my life. She simply filled the empty corners I had stopped noticing years ago. She worked as a freelance illustrator, usually sketching from the sunroom where afternoon light poured through towering windows. Sometimes I would pass by carrying my laptop and catch glimpses of colorful landscapes, children laughing in parks, or families gathered around kitchen tables. None of her drawings featured luxury penthouses or corporate towers. They celebrated ordinary moments that somehow felt extraordinary. "Do people really buy these?" I asked one evening, more curious than skeptical. She laughed softly. "People buy feelings more than pictures. They want to remember someone they love or imagine a place that makes them feel safe." Her answer lingered in my mind long after I returned to my office upstairs. Safe. It was an unusual word. My company protected billions of dollars in digital assets, yet I could not remember the last time anyone had described my home that way. Emily respected every boundary I established. She never entered my office without knocking. She never asked about confidential meetings or financial headlines. Yet somehow she learned my routines better than I knew them myself. If I worked too late, she quietly left dinner in the refrigerator with a handwritten note reminding me to eat before midnight. If an early meeting filled my calendar, breakfast waited on the counter before sunrise. She never expected anything in return. That unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I had spent decades believing every relationship operated like a contract, every kindness carrying an invisible invoice that would eventually arrive. Emily never asked for favors, promotions, introductions, or opportunities. She offered generosity with no conditions attached. One Friday evening, after another exhausting 12-hour day, I walked through the front door expecting silence. Instead, I heard laughter coming from the kitchen. Emily was attempting to bake chocolate chip cookies using one of my grandmother's handwritten recipes she had discovered tucked inside an old cookbook. Flour dusted the countertop, one cookie sheet looked hopelessly uneven, and she wore an expression somewhere between determination and defeat. "I think your grandmother measured with her heart instead of measuring cups," she admitted with an embarrassed grin. Without thinking, I laughed. It was not polite laughter for investors or courteous laughter for interviews. It was genuine, unexpected, and startling enough that we both paused. I realized then that the sound echoing through the house did not belong to a billionaire chief executive officer. It belonged to a woman who had almost forgotten she still knew how to feel at home. The smallest acts of kindness rarely announce themselves, yet they have a remarkable way of changing the direction of a life. Looking back now, I cannot point to a single grand moment when everything shifted between Emily and me. There was no dramatic confession, no unforgettable speech, no instant realization. Instead, there were dozens of quiet moments that accumulated like sunlight filling a room one morning at a time. On Monday, I discovered my laptop charging because Emily had noticed I had forgotten to plug it in after another late night of work. On Tuesday, she left a banana and a protein bar beside my briefcase because she overheard me telling my assistant that I would not have time for lunch. By Wednesday, she had somehow memorized which meetings usually left me exhausted and would casually ask, "Would you like some tea?" before I even admitted I had a headache. She never hovered. She never made me feel incapable. She simply noticed things. That was a talent I had almost forgotten existed. Most people noticed my title before they noticed me. Emily noticed me before she seemed to remember what I did for a living. One rainy evening I walked into the kitchen after another disappointing conference call with overseas investors. The deal had fallen apart after 6 months of negotiations, and although no one blamed me, I blamed myself anyway. Emily looked up from her sketchbook, studied my expression for only a second, then quietly closed the notebook. "Long day?" she asked. I nodded. Normally that would have been the end of the conversation. Most people accepted that answer and moved on. Emily opened the freezer, took out a small container of homemade chicken soup she had prepared over the weekend, warmed it on the stove, and placed the bowl in front of me without saying another word. We sat together at the kitchen island while rain tapped gently against the windows. She did not offer advice. She did not tell me everything would work out. She simply shared the silence with me, and somehow that silence felt completely different from the one I had lived with for years. A few days later I noticed something else. My grandmother's old grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped months before, but I had never bothered fixing it. Time was something I measured through quarterly earnings, not ticking hands. One Saturday afternoon I heard soft mechanical sounds coming from the hallway. Emily was sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor with several tiny tools spread around her. "I watched 3 videos before trying this," she admitted with a nervous smile. "If I make it worse, I promise I will pay to repair it." Before I could respond, the clock chimed for the first time in months. The familiar melody echoed through the house, rich and warm, carrying memories I thought had disappeared forever. I stared at the clock, then at Emily. "My grandmother used to wind it every Sunday," I whispered. Emily smiled gently. "Then maybe it deserves Sundays again." Something tightened in my chest, not painfully but tenderly, as though a forgotten part of me had quietly awakened. She had repaired more than an old clock. She had restored a memory I had been too busy to mourn. That evening I wandered past the sunroom and found Emily asleep on the sofa, her sketchbook resting open across her lap. Curious, I glanced down without meaning to invade her privacy. Instead of landscapes or family portraits, I found a pencil drawing of my garden at sunrise. Every flower, every stone path, every tree had been captured with extraordinary care. In one corner she had written a single sentence in delicate handwriting. "Even the quietest places bloom when someone chooses to stay." I closed the sketchbook exactly as I had found it and stood there longer than I should have. For years I believed success was measured by buildings, numbers, and headlines. Emily, without ever saying so directly, was teaching me that the richest life was often built from remembered coffee orders, warm bowls of soup, repaired clocks, handwritten notes, and the quiet certainty that someone would notice if you came home. Carrying the weight of the world. The day everything changed began with a calendar so full that my assistant warned me twice not to skip lunch. I promised I would eat, knowing perfectly well that I would not. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock, followed by interviews, investor calls, and a charity gala planning session before sunset. Emily noticed me gathering my files at the front door with my usual determined pace. She handed me a travel mug of coffee and smiled. "Please remember that successful people still need breakfast." I accepted the mug with a faint smile. "I will be home late." She nodded. "Then I will keep dinner warm." It was such an ordinary exchange that neither of us realized how precious those words would become. The morning disappeared beneath endless presentations and financial projections. Every conversation demanded another decision, another signature, another prediction about the future. Just after 2 o'clock, while one of the board members discussed expansion plans, my phone vibrated inside my jacket pocket. I ignored it. A minute later it vibrated again. Then a third time. My assistant, seated across the conference table, noticed my expression and quietly slid the phone toward me. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number from a local grocery store less than 5 miles from my house. I almost silenced it before something inside me whispered that I should answer. "Miss Whitmore?" a concerned voice asked. "I believe someone listed your address when we offered assistance." A woman named Emily Carter felt lightheaded while shopping. She insisted she was fine, but she became dizzy again. "We think it would be best if someone picked her up." My heart reacted before my mind could. "Is she conscious?" I asked immediately. "Yes, she is speaking with us, but she looks pale." I was already standing before the call ended. Every conversation around the conference table stopped. 12 executives turned to look at me, waiting for instructions about the meeting. For the first time in years, quarterly earnings no longer mattered. "Reschedule the afternoon," I said, collecting my keys. "Everything." One director reminded me that international investors had flown across the country for this presentation. I looked at him only briefly before replying, "They can wait." Those 3 words surprised everyone, including me. The drive that usually felt routine became painfully slow. Every red light seemed endless. Every passing minute invited another worried thought into my mind. Had she eaten enough? Had she been working too hard? Had I overlooked signs that she was not feeling well? By the time I reached the grocery store parking lot, Emily was sitting on a bench near the entrance with a bottle of water in her hands, offering an apologetic smile to the store manager. Relief washed over me the instant I saw her awake, but it lasted only seconds. As she stood to greet me, her knees weakened again, and she reached instinctively for the bench to steady herself. I crossed the distance between us without thinking, gently supporting her before she could lose her balance. "Claire," she whispered with an embarrassed laugh, "I think I accidentally scared everyone." "You scared me," I answered honestly. She looked up at me, surprised by the tremble in my voice. The store manager suggested that it was probably nothing serious but recommended an urgent care clinic for evaluation. I did not hesitate. I guided Emily carefully to my car, helping her settle into the passenger seat before fastening her seat belt. She apologized twice during the short drive, insisting she had probably skipped lunch and simply overworked herself finishing an illustration project. I listened, but my attention remained fixed on the road ahead and the growing realization that somewhere along the way, without permission and without warning, the woman who had arrived carrying 2 worn suitcases had become someone whose well-being mattered more to me than the most important business meeting of my entire year. The waiting room felt strangely quiet, yet every passing second sounded louder than the board meetings I had abandoned. Emily insisted she could walk without assistance, but I stayed close enough that if she stumbled again I could catch her before she reached the floor. The receptionist greeted us with a reassuring smile and handed me a clipboard with several admission forms while a nurse guided Emily toward a chair to check her blood pressure and temperature. "We will bring her back as soon as possible," the nurse said kindly. I nodded, grateful for the calm professionalism in her voice, then looked down at the paperwork in my hands. Name. Date of birth. Address. Emergency contact. Insurance information. Each line was simple enough until my eyes settled on one question printed in clear black letters. Relationship to patient. My pen stopped moving. Friend. The word appeared first in my mind, but it felt strangely incomplete. Emily was certainly my friend, yet that single word failed to explain why I had walked out of the most important meeting of the quarter without hesitation. Roommate. That answer was technically accurate, but it reduced months of shared breakfasts, handwritten notes, repaired clocks, quiet conversations, and evenings that had slowly transformed my empty house into something that finally resembled a home. Landlord. That sounded cold, distant, almost insulting. Employer. Completely wrong. Emily had never worked for me, never depended on my company, never treated me like a chief executive officer instead of an ordinary woman trying to navigate another difficult day. My hand remained frozen above the paper as people quietly moved around the waiting room. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed at a picture book while an elderly couple spoke softly to one another. Life continued without noticing that one simple question had suddenly become impossible for me to answer. The receptionist looked up after a few moments and offered an understanding smile. "Take your time," she said gently. "There is no rush." I appreciated her kindness, but it did not make the decision any easier. I realized I was not struggling to complete a form. I was struggling to admit something to myself that had been growing quietly for weeks. Emily had entered my life as a temporary guest. Somewhere between morning coffee, shared dinners, rainy evenings, and countless acts of quiet kindness, she had become someone whose happiness mattered deeply to me. The realization arrived so naturally that I almost wondered how I had failed to notice it before. At that moment the nurse returned briefly with another question. "Is there any close family member we should contact if additional information is needed?" Without thinking, I answered before logic had the chance to interrupt. "I am here," I said. The words left my mouth so naturally that I surprised myself. The nurse simply nodded and continued walking, but I remained standing there, replaying my own response. I looked down at the unfinished form once more. Slowly, carefully, I wrote 2 words beside the question that had held my hand motionless for so long. Family friend. It was not a legal title, nor did it fully describe what Emily had become to me, but it was the closest truth I could honestly write. As I set the clipboard on the counter, I glanced toward the hallway where she had disappeared only minutes earlier. For the first time in many years, I was no longer measuring success by stock prices, acquisitions, or headlines. I was measuring it by the simple hope that one woman would walk back through those doors with a reassuring smile and tell me she was going to be all right. In that quiet waiting room, surrounded by strangers, I finally understood that the heart often recognizes the truth long before the mind finds the courage to give it a name. When the nurse finally called my name, I stood so quickly that the magazine on my lap slid onto the floor without me noticing. She led me down a quiet hallway lined with softly lit examination rooms before stopping outside a partially open door. "She is doing much better," the nurse said with a reassuring smile. The physician believes dehydration, exhaustion, and several missed meals all contributed to her dizziness. "We are running a few routine tests to be safe, but everything looks encouraging." I felt my shoulders relax for the first time that afternoon. I thanked the nurse and stepped inside. Emily looked up from the examination bed, an adhesive bandage resting on her arm where blood had been drawn. The color had already begun returning to her cheeks, though she still looked tired. The moment our eyes met, she smiled apologetically. "I really ruined your afternoon, did I not?" I shook my head before she could finish the sentence. "You did nothing except remind me that some things are more important than meetings." She studied my face as though searching for any sign that I was only trying to be polite. Instead, she found something I had never allowed many people to see. Concern. Relief. Gratitude. "The doctor says I should start treating my own body as kindly as I treat everyone else," she said with a quiet laugh. "Apparently coffee does not count as lunch." "Neither does skipping breakfast," I replied. She smiled again. "So you noticed?" I almost laughed at the question. I had noticed everything. I noticed when she tied her hair back before beginning a new illustration. I noticed how she hummed softly while watering the flowers every Saturday morning. I noticed that she always saved the last chocolate chip cookie because she assumed I would want it later, even when I rarely ate dessert. Somewhere along the way, paying attention to Emily had become as natural as breathing. The physician entered a few moments later carrying a tablet and greeted us warmly. He explained that the examination and initial tests looked reassuring. Stress, dehydration, inconsistent meals, and too little rest had gradually caught up with her. "The good news," he said, "is that this is something you can absolutely recover from with better balance, proper nutrition, and a little patience." Emily thanked him sincerely, promising she would follow every recommendation. Before leaving, the physician smiled at both of us. She is fortunate to have someone who came as quickly as you did. Support makes recovery easier. After he closed the door, silence settled between us for several seconds. Emily looked down at her hands before speaking so softly I almost missed the words. No one has ever dropped everything for me before. My heart tightened. You would have done the same for me. She lifted her eyes and gently shook her head. Maybe. But you actually did. Those simple words carried more weight than any award I had ever accepted. We sat together without rushing to fill the quiet. Sunlight filtered through the narrow window, painting soft, golden patterns across the floor. Emily reached for the paper cup of water beside the bed and smiled faintly. When my parents passed away, I became very good at convincing myself that I should never inconvenience anyone. It always seemed easier to solve everything alone. I listened without interrupting. Then you came into my life, she continued. You gave me a safe place to stay, but somehow you gave me something even bigger than a roof. You made me feel like I belonged somewhere again. I lowered my eyes for a moment because I was suddenly afraid she might notice how emotional I had become. The truth was almost impossible to ignore now. I had believed I was helping Emily through a temporary hardship, yet she had quietly rescued me from a loneliness I had accepted as permanent. As we waited for the discharge papers, I realized neither of us would leave that clinic as the same women who had walked through its doors only a few hours earlier. The drive home was quieter than any conversation we could have forced, yet it never felt uncomfortable. Emily rested against the passenger seat with the discharge papers folded neatly in her lap while I kept both hands on the steering wheel, glancing toward her more often than I cared to admit. As the late afternoon sun stretched across the highway, she finally broke the silence with a gentle smile. I found out something today. I looked over briefly. What is that? She turned toward me with an expression that was both grateful and curious. Your assistant called while I was waiting for the doctor. She wanted to know if the board meeting should be moved to tomorrow because you had canceled the entire afternoon. I hesitated. She should not have bothered you with work. Emily shook her head. She apologized afterward. She thought I already knew. She paused for a moment before asking the question I had been hoping to avoid. Claire, was it really such an important meeting? There was no reason to hide the truth. It involved our largest expansion project this year. Investors flew in from California and Texas. We had been preparing for months. Emily stared at me in disbelief. You left all of that because of me? I answered without taking my eyes off the road. There was nowhere else I needed to be. She felt completely silent. When we reached a red light, I glanced toward her and noticed tears gathering in her eyes. She quickly looked away, embarrassed. I am sorry, she whispered. I promised myself I would never become someone else's responsibility. I parked in the driveway a few minutes later but left the engine off. Neither of us hurried to go inside. The evening air was calm, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass through the open windows. Emily drew a slow breath before speaking again. After my parents passed away, relatives helped for a little while, but everyone had their own lives. I learned very quickly that people usually expect you to recover on a schedule. Eventually they stop asking how you are doing because they assume you are fine. So I became very good at smiling, saying everything was okay, and handling every problem alone. I listened without interrupting because I recognized pieces of myself inside her story. The strange thing, she continued with a faint laugh, is that after enough years, you start believing you really do not need anyone. I nodded slowly. I understand that better than you think. She looked at me with quiet surprise. Do you? I leaned back against the seat and watched the fading sunlight through the windshield. People imagine success protects you from loneliness. It does not. It simply gives you a larger house to feel lonely inside. The higher my company grew, the fewer people spoke to me without wanting something. I convinced myself that independence was strength because it was easier than admitting I missed having someone who cared whether I came home. Emily reached across the center console and gently rested her hand over mine. It was a simple gesture, warm and steady, asking for nothing while offering everything. Then maybe, she said softly, we have both been pretending for too long. I looked down at our hands before meeting her eyes again. For the first time, neither of us seemed afraid of the silence between us because it no longer felt empty. It felt shared. As we walked toward the front door together, I realized. The grand estate no longer looked like an impressive property standing behind elegant gates. It looked like the place where two women, each carrying years of quiet loneliness, had finally begun to understand that accepting another person's care was not a sign of weakness. It was the beginning of learning what home truly meant. The weeks that followed did not transform our lives overnight, but they changed the direction of them in quiet, lasting ways. The first promise we made to each other was surprisingly simple. We would both stop treating ourselves like machines that only existed to accomplish tasks. Every morning Emily made sure breakfast actually happened instead of becoming another forgotten intention, and every evening I closed my laptop before dinner no matter how many unread emails still waited in my inbox. At first it felt almost irresponsible. Years of habit whispered that successful people never stopped working. Emily challenged that belief with a gentle smile every single day. Your company deserves your best, she would say while setting 2 plates on the table, but so does your life. Somewhere along the way, I stopped arguing. My assistant noticed the changes before anyone else. One afternoon she walked into my office carrying a folder and hesitated before speaking. You have been leaving at 6 o'clock every evening for almost a month, she said with an amused smile. Should I be worried? I surprised both of us by laughing. No, I replied. You should have been worried before. The truth was impossible to ignore. I was sleeping through the night again. My headaches became less frequent. I no longer measured every hour by productivity alone. The remarkable part was that the company did not collapse because I chose to protect a few hours of my own life. In fact, my leadership became steadier because exhaustion no longer dictated every decision. Emily was changing too. Encouraged by the physician's advice and our countless conversations, she finally submitted several illustrations to a national publishing house she had admired for years. She almost withdrew the application twice, convinced someone more talented deserved the opportunity. I quietly placed the envelope back on the kitchen counter each time she tried to hide it. You believe in everyone else, I reminded her. Now borrow my belief until you can find your own. 3 weeks later an email arrived inviting her to illustrate an upcoming children's book. She read the message twice before covering her mouth in complete disbelief. Then she looked at me with tears shining in her eyes and whispered, I almost never send it. I hugged her without thinking, and she wrapped her arms around me just as naturally. Neither of us spoke for several moments because words would only have interrupted the quiet joy filling the room. That evening we celebrated with homemade pasta, fresh bread from the neighborhood bakery, and a slice of lemon cake Emily insisted tasted better than anything from an expensive restaurant. We laughed more during that simple dinner than I had during entire years of corporate galas. As summer slowly gave way to early autumn, our temporary arrangement quietly lost its expiration date. Neither of us mentioned apartment repairs anymore. Neither of us discussed moving boxes or departure dates. The guest room no longer felt like a guest room because Emily had become part of the rhythm of the house itself. Fresh flowers still appeared beside the dining room window every Monday. The grandfather clock still chimed every Sunday after she carefully wound it with the same respect my grandmother once had. Every evening we ended the day on the back porch, watching the sun disappear behind the trees while sharing stories that had nothing to do with business reports or deadlines. I began to understand that love is not always announced through dramatic declarations. Sometimes it reveals itself through consistency, through showing up day after day, through choosing another person's well-being as naturally as your own. Emily never tried to rescue me from my career, and I never tried to reshape her dreams. Instead, we quietly became the kind of presence that allowed each other to become healthier, braver, and more fully ourselves. Looking back now, I believe that was the greatest success either of us had ever achieved. 1 year later, on a bright spring morning, Emily and I found ourselves walking through the same urgent care clinic for a routine follow-up appointment the physician had recommended after encouraging her to maintain healthier habits. Everything felt different, yet wonderfully familiar. She looked radiant, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had rediscovered both her health and her dreams. The children's book she had illustrated had become a national bestseller, and framed copies now rested beside the photographs that had gradually filled our once empty home. As for me, I was still leading the company I had devoted so many years to building, but I no longer confused professional success with a meaningful life. My calendar now included family dinners, weekend walks, and evenings spent listening to Emily describe new characters she hoped to draw. Somewhere along the way, our temporary arrangement had quietly become permanent. The guest room had transformed into an art studio, and the house that once echoed with silence now carried laughter, conversation, and the comforting sounds of two lives growing together. When the receptionist handed us the registration form, I accepted it with a smile that surprised even me. I filled in our names, our address, our insurance information, and every familiar detail with calm certainty. Then I reached the question that had once left my hand frozen above the paper. Relationship to patient. This time there was no hesitation. No uncertainty. No searching for words that felt almost right but never quite complete. I simply wrote one word with steady handwriting. Wife. Emily glanced at the form before I handed it back to the receptionist. She looked at the answer for several seconds before turning toward me with tears shining in her eyes. They were not tears of sadness. They were the quiet tears that arrive when life gives you something you once believed you would never have. She reached for my hand, and I intertwined my fingers with hers as naturally as if they had always belonged there. I still remember the first time you filled out one of those forms, she whispered. I laughed softly. So do I. I thought one question was impossible to answer. She squeezed my hand gently. Maybe the answer was growing long before either of us knew its name. The nurse called us inside, congratulated Emily on maintaining excellent health, and smiled warmly when she noticed the matching wedding bands neither of us had been wearing a year earlier. The appointment itself lasted only a few minutes, but the journey that had brought us there had changed everything about who we were. As we stepped back into the sunshine, I paused on the sidewalk and looked toward the parking lot where fear had once consumed every thought in my mind. That difficult afternoon had seemed overwhelming at the time, yet without it I might never have recognized what truly mattered. Life has an extraordinary way of revealing its greatest gifts through ordinary moments. Sometimes love arrives quietly over morning coffee, handwritten notes, repaired clocks, shared meals, and patient conversations. Sometimes healing begins the moment someone chooses to stay instead of walking away. If there is one lesson our story has taught me, it is that success can build beautiful houses, but kindness turns them into homes. Ambition can earn admiration, but compassion earns trust. And the richest life is never measured by the size of a bank account or the title on a business card. It is measured by the people who make you feel seen, accepted, and loved exactly as you are. On the day Emily first carried 2 worn suitcases through my front door, I believed I was offering someone temporary shelter. I could never have imagined that she would become the home my heart had been searching for all along.